Chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. So if you have your Bibles, we invite your attention there. Somebody once said, you can always tell a Texan, but you just can't tell him very much. I guess in our culture, sometimes we sort of have people who are labeled as sometimes being bullheaded. Now, we're going to meet a group of religious people today in Matthew chapter 15 who sort of have gained that reputation for themselves. Now, who do you think that may be? The Pharisees. You're exactly right. Now, we're going to talk about some pretty interesting things about tradition versus truth. Okay? Tradition versus truth. Now, I have a few things I want to share with you before we begin. So, in Matthew chapter 15, Jesus begins to address the crowd. And most of this crowd are the religious elite of the day. They are pretty much what we would think of to be the most religious people on earth. Okay, so he addresses them. It's interesting what he begins to say. Now, we're going to talk about this title, The Troubles with Traditions. All right? And these people had a lot of them. So anyway, we'll talk about some of that today. Now, there's a couple of things that I want us to note. Let's begin in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 1. It says, Then came Jesus to the scribes and Pharisees which were of Jerusalem, saying. Now, the scribes, what is their job? Does anybody know what they do for a living? Say what?
Writing.
They write, yes. And what are they writing? That's right, the Old Testament scriptures. They are literally the recorders of the Old Testament. And I'm telling you, this is very meticulous. I did a study one time here a couple years back about how we got the Bible. And we talked a lot in detail about the scribes and how they would very meticulously count the letters in a line. And they would make sure that every letter was accounted for. And that's what they would do all day long. And they would have their ink and pen and some kind of scroll, and they would record the scriptures. Now, the Pharisees are closely kin to the scribes, but they're not the same. Okay? Notice what they're saying. Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders, for they wash not their hands when they eat bread? But he answered and said unto them, Why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? So it's interesting, there are two different things that are being asked, and the Pharisees said, Why do your disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? And Jesus said, Why do you transgress God's commands? All right, I want to notice several things as we talk about this. I want to break this down a little bit, talking about traditions. Okay? Let's go to Galatians chapter 1. Can you think of any good traditions? Anybody? 4th of July. Yes, that's a very good one. Anybody else? Valentine's Day. All right. The day of love, right? It's interesting, the story behind that. Who knows that story? Just curious. Oh, come on now. That's a good one. There was an emperor in Rome who outlawed marriage because he wanted the young men to go to war. And a preacher who was named Valentine, he married people in secret. It's pretty neat, huh? It's a very good tradition that we have. Okay, yeah, it's coming up soon, isn't it? Is it? That's pretty neat. What is that, March 17th? All right, that's exciting. Birthdays are definitely good traditions. I'll tell you a good tradition I have in our family, at least in Mariah's family. When we go to visit her home in Fairhope, and all her family is there, they always make cinnamon rolls with icing on them. And I always look forward to being there with all those just for the cinnamon rolls. I don't care about the people. I don't even want to be around them. No, I'm kidding. But that's a good tradition. You know, traditions are sometimes very good. And I want to give you one of these. Let's go to Galatians chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Will somebody please read that for us?
For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism. I have persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers.
Okay. The Pharisees have a lot of traditions. A lot of them are religious traditions, but they are not commanded by God. For instance, they said you had to wash your hands before you sit down at a common meal. They believed that if you did not do that, then you were not religious. Is that good or bad thinking? Yeah, that's not good. Okay, that's not good. You know, one good tradition that we have, and sometimes we get traditions and truth sort of mixed up. One good tradition that we have religiously is a Sunday night worship service. Wednesday night Bible study. Those are good traditions. But I'll tell you this, you may not know it, Sunday night worship service is not commanded by God. Now, it's commanded by the eldership, which makes it binding. You with me? But sometimes we get traditions and truth mixed up, and all of a sudden we think in the first century that they had a Sunday morning service and a Sunday night service. No, they didn't. They didn't have that in the first century. We have made that a religious tradition. Now, it's a good one. And the reason why the Sunday night service came about, you may not know, is because for people who had to work on Sunday morning and they missed the Sunday morning service, they could still worship on Sunday. So there's a reason why there are good traditions. Wednesday night Bible study is a good tradition because in the middle of the week we have a chance to stop and reflect upon religious things. As far as I can tell, they didn't have that in the first century. In fact, they met every single day. So you talk about a good tradition, that would be a good one. Now, he said, I was exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Now, this man that's writing in Galatians chapter 1, what was his religious background? He was a Pharisee, wasn't he? Of course he was zealous of the traditions of his fathers. He was the one that Jesus would be addressing in Matthew chapter 15, who said, you better wash your hands before you eat or you're not religious. All right, let's talk about bad traditions. What are some bad traditions that we have in our society? There's a big party down in Louisiana every February. What do they call that? That is a bad tradition. I wonder how many people either die or are thrown in prison every year because of that tradition. I'd say probably a lot. There's probably a good amount of trouble that takes place because of that bad tradition. Can you think of any more? You know, when I think about this, I think about Colossians 2:8 when he said, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. There are bad traditions. He calls them traditions of men. Now, I want to end with this. Let's talk about binding traditions. Are there such things as traditions that are binding religiously? Can you think of any? The Lord's Supper. Man, you hit that right on the head. In fact, I have it written right here on my notes. That is a binding tradition. Let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Now, what I'm going to do is, I'm giving you 3 areas of tradition. Good traditions, bad traditions, binding traditions. Now, I want to spark a little bit of discussion after this. See what you think as far as a question goes. And what we're going to do is try to make some practical applications about religious things that we will come across, and we've got to decide, is this a religious tradition that is a good one, a bad one, or a binding one? Okay?
Well, taking the Lord's Supper is not a tradition. It's a command.
Okay, yes, it is a command, and it is also a tradition. Now, they can fall under both categories, okay? A command can be a tradition. For instance, let me explain. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, okay? Sometimes a tradition and a command are in the same category, okay? I'm glad you brought that up, by the way. Will somebody read that? 2 Thessalonians 2, 14 and 15. Okay. He said, you were taught these traditions, and they are taught literally by the commands of God. In fact, you go to chapter 3 and verse 6, and he said, now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly and not after the tradition. And not after the tradition which he received of us. So, yes, sometimes the tradition and command can fall under the same category, and I would call these binding traditions. Now, can you think of any others? We talked about the Lord's Supper. What else? Meeting on the first day of the week. That is a binding tradition. In fact, in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, they came together on the first day of the week to break bread. Now, what time you decide to do that, if a congregation decides, I heard of a church, they said, you know what, we're not going to have a Sunday morning service or a Sunday evening service. What we're going to do is we're going to add an hour to our original service, and we're going to have it beginning in the middle of the day from 2 to 4. Something like that. I can't remember the exact time. 1 to 3, 2 to 4, something like that. Is that okay for them to do that? Yeah, that's completely fine. They can choose whatever time they want as long as they meet on the first day of the week. Now, I know some brethren, they would have a fit. They say, no, the scriptural time is 9:30, okay? You can't meet any other time except for 9:30 and 5, all right? Well, that's not it. The first day of the week. Somebody said this, talking about tradition versus truth, okay? These religious people sometimes are hard to be around. Here's what somebody said. You know you are hard to be around if you have to stand on your head to smile. If your parrot only says swear words. If your parents move and don't tell you where. If your imaginary friends get mad at you too. You know you're hard to be around if telemarketers hang up on you. I can't stand those telemarketers, man. They're always calling. And the last one. You know you're hard to be around if someone keeps sending your obituary to the paper. Well, Jesus is trying to correct something here. He said, look, I understand you want to be religious. You're the Pharisees. But let's calm down a little bit. Okay? Let's talk about what's really commanded by God. Now, I'll tell you this. People that live like Pharisees, they cannot stand what I just said. What do you mean, calm down? Yeah. Your religious traditions can actually harm the work of God. You say, oh, I don't know about that. I have seen it happen in the church over and over and over and over again. Now, let me give you a scenario. Okay, let's talk about some discussion for a minute. I want to see what you think. Now that we've talked about 3 areas of tradition, good tradition, bad tradition, binding tradition, let's give some scenarios. Is it wrong if you don't dress up to come to church?
Is it wrong if you don't want?
If you don't dress up to come to church?
No, it ain't wrong.
Okay. Are you sure?
Yeah.
All right.
You may not have nothing to dress up in, so how could that be wrong?
Yeah.
Or you may be coming straight from work, and if it's a choice of coming in my work clothes or not at all, because I want to go get dressed up, well, I'm not going to make it because I don't have time to get dressed up, and I'll come in my work clothes.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit something about how I was trained. And I love the school where I was trained. But I think students that come out of there sometimes, if they're not careful, they can make a big mistake like I made. I made this mistake. You see, when we come to school, we are expected everywhere we go. It doesn't matter where you go in public for any formal setting, you better have on a suit and tie. That was the words that came out of our director's mouth. He said, you better have on a suit. In fact, he said, if you go out in public, I don't ever want to see you in shorts. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to play basketball in 90-degree weather in sweatpants. I'm sorry. But that was a philosophy. And when I graduated school, on Wednesday night services, I came to church every single time with my suit and tie on. And guess what? I was the only one. I did this for years. Finally, a lady came to me in Meridian. This is my second work, okay? So I had gone all the way through my first work, and then my second work, here I am, same philosophy. And she came to me one night and she said, look, I don't want to be rude, but don't you think you're a little overdressed? And it just stopped me in my tracks. I thought, you know what? You are so right. I'm the only one like this. You know, my philosophy was, and I was so judgmental. I remember going to a funeral one time, and I saw a man who was a member of the church in a suit and tie, and I had never seen him like that before. And I was so mean that I thought to myself, his heart is wrong. Because he comes to church every single week in his jeans and button-up shirt, and now he comes to a funeral in a suit. And I look back on that and I feel so ignorant. Who am I to judge this man's heart by the clothes that he has on his back? I'll tell you, I had a rude awakening when I went to Fiji. And the first time I saw this was in American Samoa. And I saw people come to worship service in shorts and flip-flops. It shocked me. You talk about culture shock. I could not believe it. But this is normal for them. It's completely normal. We have created a tradition in the United States that, in my opinion, is not good. Now, am I saying that you are wrong if you dress up for church? Obviously, I'm wearing a suit and tie right now. But I'll tell you a story, something that happened not long ago, about 5 months ago. There was a young man visiting this congregation, and I kept trying to set up a Bible study with this man. And sometimes he'll even show up periodically still. So anyway, I talked to him, and he said, yeah, my mom's out in the car waiting, and I went out there to talk to her. And I invited her to church. I said, well, look, next time, instead of sitting out here reading your Bible, why don't you come in and sit with us? We'd love to have you come in church. You know what her first words that came out of her mouth? She said, I don't have anything to wear. Come in there. Everybody else is dressed up. I'd be the only one not dressed up. And I thought to myself, so we have created an atmosphere that will exclude you because you can't afford to go buy some nice clothes. And her number one hang-up was, I'll be different than everyone else. Now, understand, it's hard to get past that. You say, well, what are we supposed to do? We all supposed to wear shorts and flip-flops? No, I don't think so. But I have heard brethren from their own mouths condemn people because they didn't wear a tie when they served on the Lord's table. And the idea of this religious atmosphere, tradition takes over truth. Because I'll be honest with you, now that I've studied it, I don't think God really cares what you're wearing. We care what we're wearing. We're the ones who say, oh, he's coming to church. He should have worn this.
God seen you from the inside, but He'll see you from the outside.
You're exactly right. In
Don't
fact,
care what they think.
there's a specific verse in the Bible I want us to go to. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. It says exactly what James just said. Okay? Nowhere in the Bible do you ever read about people dressing up to come to church. Is it a good idea? Yeah, it's a good idea. Should we be respectful to God when we come before Him? Sure. But if I tell you you're wrong because you're not wearing the right clothes, friend, guess who's wrong? Not him, but me. I would be the one that would be wrong. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. Now the context is different than what we're talking about today, but the principle is still the same. God said, I have chosen someone else to be king, not because of his outward appearance, but because what's in here. All right, will somebody read that? 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. The Lord looks at the heart. So, my view is, if it were up to me to decide what I want to wear to church, I could wear whatever I want to. Now, to be respectful to the congregation and the position that I'm in, I choose to wear a suit and tie. But I'll just be real straightforward with you. If I were not preaching, you would not see this tie on my neck. Okay? I don't like it. I don't want to wear it. I don't like suits. I don't want to wear them. Okay?
Josh,
Yes, sir.
why would we not want to wear the best that we have in the presence of God?
Sure.
If you go to the White House to see the president, you wouldn't dress sloppy.
That's right.
If we're going to be in the presence of God, we ought to wear the best that we have. In
Sure.
our spirit, in our heart, and in our clothes.
Yep.
If not, you set a standard for people to come in like they come off the farm.
Yeah. And I agree with that 100%.
Not what you said.
Okay?
You know what I'm saying?
What I said was, it's my choice to choose for me,
That's true.
and your choice to choose for you. Now, if I did come off the farm and I'm ready to go to church service and I don't want to go home and change, I can wear it to church if I want to. And you could judge me all you want to, but guess who would be wrong? Not me. I wouldn't be wrong for wearing my farm clothes to church. The man looking down on me would be wrong. You see, that's what we're talking about when we talk about good traditions, bad traditions, and binding traditions. What you wear to church is not a binding tradition.
If what you do causes someone else to fail, then that would be a different thing.
That's true. Sure enough. And that would be a sort of a discretion you would have to make. Are my clothes going to cause someone to sin? Well, I highly doubt it.
With modesty.
With immodesty, definitely so. I would definitely say someone needs to cover themselves up when they come in church, especially if they're a lady. There's no doubt about that. That's pretty black and white. But the issues that are not black and white are tradition. And Jesus says, you're placing tradition over truth. So that's my point. All right, let's move on. Verse 4, he said, for God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, and he that curseth father and mother, let him die the death. But you say, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, shall be free. Thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. So, let's talk about something a little more serious. Whether or not you wear certain clothes to church, to me, it's none of my business. It's not serious to me at all. You can choose whatever you want to do. Jesus said, it's not serious to me either. It's a tradition. But let's talk about a command, he said. Let's turn the coin over. Because your tradition transgresses the commands of God. Now, what tradition is he talking about that transgressed the command of God? Now, it's a little bit confusing in the King James, but who knows what Jesus is talking about here? In Matthew chapter 15, verses 4 through 6, I have this here in the ESV. I want to share it with you. For God commanded, honor your father and your mother, and whosoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, he need not honor his father. You see the huge transgression there? Jesus said, okay, let's talk about traditions for a minute, because there's a binding one that you have not been keeping, and it's honoring your father and your mother. It's interesting what Jesus would say about these people, and I'm going to read it in just a minute. He said, they would strain at a gnat and swallow a what? A camel. These are the exact things that I was talking about earlier. Okay? Let's talk about what is a big deal. Breaking the command to honor your father and your mother for the Pharisee is breaking one of the 10 Commandments. So he said, you can forget about all the little traditions that you've established that aren't even part of the law. He said, let's talk about the law. Because the law says you're supposed to honor your father and your mother. And you know what you do? You tell your parents you don't have any money left over because you gave it all away to support the Lord's work. Your parents are starving because they're not able to work anymore. They're old and they need you as the child to take care of them. And you say, well, I'm sorry, Mom, Dad. I know you took care of me all my life. But I've given all my money away. After all, I am religious. So I don't have any money to take care of you with. And Jesus said, you just broke one of the 10 Commandments. As religious, Mr. Pharisee, as you are, you just chose not to honor your father and your mother because you say, I'm not going to take care of you. Well, it's interesting how the tables have turned then. I think too many times, like we mentioned earlier, they focus too much attention on what everybody else is doing and not on themselves. All right? Any question or comments you want to make on that? All right, let's go to Matthew chapter 23, verses 23 and 24. I'll give you a couple of scriptures here, and then we'll sort of move on from this. It's interesting the language that Jesus uses in Matthew 23 to address these same people. Look at verse 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Verse 14. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Verse 15, the same thing. Verse 23. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, have omitted the weightier matters of the law. Judgment, mercy, faith. These things ought you to have done, and not leave the other undone. You blind guides which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. So I think it's pretty clear what Jesus is thinking and feeling about these individuals. Mark chapter 7, verses 4 and 5, he said, when you come to the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be which they receive to hold the washing of cups and pots and brazen vessels and the tables. And when the Pharisees and scribes asked him, saying, why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? What was Jesus' answer to this? Do you remember? He said, it's not what comes or goes into your mouth, but what? What comes out of your mouth? You see, because what comes out of your mouth comes forth from the heart, such as adulteries, fornications, murderers, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. He said, these are the things that defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands, it doesn't defile a man at all. All right. So a man said, I married Mrs. Wright, but I didn't know her first name was Always. A bad trait of religious people, just like the Pharisees, is they're always right. Everything they always say or do is always right. Well, we can all be wrong. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing out here. All right. Let's talk about what Jesus says about these people. Matthew chapter 15, we'll keep on going there. Verse 7, he said, You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy to you, saying, This people draweth nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And I have quoted that passage many, many times, and oftentimes did not realize the context in which it was in. Something so small turned into something very large. They had the tradition that men should wash their hands before they eat. And Jesus said, okay, you can hold that tradition. You try to bind it on other people, you'll be the one that's wrong. Verse 10, He called the multitude, said unto them, Hear and understand, not that which goeth into the mouth that defileth a man, but which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. Then came his disciples and said unto him, Knowest thou that the Pharisees were offended after they heard this saying? Well, of course they were. Why wouldn't they have been? They thought everything they said or did was always correct. And that's just not the case. None of us fall into that category. All right, now notice this. This was interesting to me when I was studying this class, how Jesus put the icing on the cake here. And I thought to myself, I do not want to be this guy. Ever. I don't ever want to be this person. Notice what he said. Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, they shall both fall into a ditch. Religious zeal is very good, but it can be deadly.
Well, a tradition you can break, but a command you can't.
That's true. The trouble is we have to decide what is tradition and what is truth. And I'll tell you, something that I have found sometimes is something that I thought so much was truth can be a tradition. And you know why that takes place? Because of growth. What I have found is people who do not grow, they will stay the same their whole Christian walk. You'd think it'd be different. You say, oh man, that person's become weak because they changed their position on something. I think it's just the opposite. You know what he's done? He has grown in his faith. He's studied. He's learned. He has realized this may not be as important as everybody said it was. And I'll tell you right now, I am notorious for thinking on my own. I will think all by myself. I don't have to have somebody shove something in my mouth. And I will tell you, something that I have thought was a tradition, just like wearing this thing. About 10 years ago, I would have thought you were going to hell if you didn't wear a tie to church. And I said, your heart's in the wrong place. But guess whose heart was in the wrong place? It was mine. You see, I had to grow in order to realize that. Well, to me, people who never change their views on something, I know why they don't. Because they're not growing. They will stay the same in their faith for 40 years. Always the same. They go along with the major doctrines of the brotherhood, and they say, oh, if you don't believe this major doctrine because this preacher, and this preacher believe this, then you're lost. You can believe that if you want to, but I'll tell you right now, I can think for myself. Everyone else in this congregation can think for themselves.
Well, show me what you believe.
That's right. That's what I tell people.
Believe it, and I don't. Show me
Sure
where
enough.
you believe.
You tell me where it is in the Bible. Well, my view is 1 Samuel 16:7 clears up the idea of what we wear at church. And that's where I'll show people that every time. So what did Jesus mean then when he said, every plant that my Father has not planted will be rooted up? What did he mean? To me, he said, the Pharisees think they're the ones who condemning everybody to hell. But they've never been right with God. They were never planted. And I began to think to myself, why? How could someone who is so steeped in the Word of God, who would say that they love God so much, how could they be thought of by Jesus in this way? And I began to come up with some things. Number one, it's because they are mean. They are mean about what they believe. They hold tradition over truth. They do not know how to equate with, okay, did God say this or not? I'll give you three more. They look down on others. They were fault finders. And religiously, they did not love people. All right. Thank you very much for your time.